Today, we are going to discuss about the effects of climate change. To begin with, we must depart from the fact that future effects of climate change, which are frequently estimated by mathematical models, have been well defined to the end of the century, and strongly depend on future carbon dioxide emissions. First, it's important to understand that the cumulative emissions that the planet has had from the Industrial Revolution up to today might, in some degree, have a strong effect on the end of the century. Nevertheless, there is still an opportunity window. That means that if we, as a planet, change behavior and apply strong reductions in our emissions coming from fossil fuels and deforestation, we can reach a situation in which the effects of climate change won't be catastrophic. That's essentially what the goals of Paris Agreement defined. According to them, if global warming at 2100 reach between 1.5 and 2 centigrade degrees over pre-industrial level, the most difficult, the catastrophic events of climate change will be avoided. The problem, the essential problem, is that summing up all the national mitigation commitments to the Paris Agreement, there is not enough mitigation to reach the goal. There is still a very big gap between current policies, national current policies, and the required goals. So essentially, we have two possible future outcomes. The first of one is continue with these weak mitigation policies, and in that case, strong adverse effects of climate change must be unavoidable. The second possibility is applying a very sharp and deep mitigation policy, mostly in the next 2 decades. That means before 2050, to reach Paris Agreement's goals and avoid the adverse or negative scenarios. Here we have a chart in which we can see that carbon dioxide emissions are still going up. Here we have the total emissions of greenhouse gases since 1990 to 2018. As a result of COVID, the crisis sparked by the pandemic and other restrictions, it seems that in the last years, carbon emissions are reaching a kind of plateau, are making a kind of peak, but they are still very high, and we cannot have evidence of declining emissions. That is very important. This chart is very interesting because it breaks down emissions by greenhouse gases and by economic sectors. Here we can have a detailed analysis about the emission gap between Paris Agreement goals, mostly the idea of keeping global warming to not more than 1.5 centigrade degrees at the end of the century, and the sum of all national commitments. In the black time series, in the black line, we can see the evolution of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions, and they are more or less at the same levels, going a little bit up compared to the 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed. But between present 2022 and 2030, which is the final goal of the final period of application of the Paris Agreement, emissions must get down by at least 70% to reach the goal of keeping global warming below or to the maximum of 1.5 centigrade degrees. In the light blue line, we can see current policies and policies linked with accepted targets and pledges from different countries. So the gap is very, very high. We can see that according with current goals of the countries, actual emissions are not going to get down. They are going to keep more or less stable up to 2030, and we need an about 70% reduction even in emissions. So the gap is huge, and it's very difficult to change. Here we have the same idea, but taking into account the amount of predicted warming of the planet in different cases. Even if all the pledges and targets defined by countries are going to be fulfilled, future warming will be at the end of the century 2.1 centigrade degrees. If we take into account only the targets of the countries, warming will go up to 2.4. That means that we are well above the goal, which is to reach only 1.5 warming. That is the difference, and that is the risk the planet is facing as a result of the weakness of current policies. Here we have more or less detailed explanation about the effects of climate change at the end of the century, according to different possible scenarios of warming. The first one is 1.5. That means that the Paris Agreement goals will be fulfilled. Then we have a second scenario between 2 and 3 centigrade degrees, between 3 and 4, and 4 and 5. We have a very detailed list of situations, but I make a kind of summary. This is taken from the book of Mark Maslin, Climate Change, a very short introduction, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. If we reach the goals of Paris Agreement, 1.5 warming, which we can expect is increasing extreme climatic events, an important biodiversity loss, mostly in sensitive ecosystems such as the rainforest, coral reefs, the Arctic, and so on, and also an important expansion of tropical infections. In the most possible, the most plausible scenario, according to current policies, in a situation in which global warming will be between 2 and 3 centigrade degrees, we can have major climate disasters. Small islands might disappear or become uninhabitable. We have an important heat morbidity or mortality, and an important decline both in fisheries and agriculture. If temperatures goes up between 3 and 4 centigrade degrees, we might experience a major biodiversity loss, extreme weather events, much more deep than in the other scenarios, mass migration, which means hundreds of million people migrating as a result of climate change, and a strong decline in food production and water scarcity. And finally, if global warming ends up between 4 and 5 centigrade degrees, we might have catastrophic biodiversity loss, a collapse, that's very important, a collapse of agricultural yields. That means a very, very serious problem of food security. So hunger can be a common problem at the end of the century, and a situation in which a major coastal city must be abandoned. So this is the situation taking into account only the effects of anthropogenic emissions. Here we can classify the effects in 3 different classes. First, climate events linked with the storms, droughts, floods, expansion of tropical disease, scarcity of water, problems of small islands, which can disappear. Secondly, a decline or even collapse of agricultural and fishery yields, and very serious threats to food security. That is probably the most sensitive problem linked to climate change. And finally, a strong decline in biodiversity. It must be taking into account that current extinction rates are between 100 and 1,000 times higher than those observed in the pre-industrial levels. Well, those are the direct effects of anthropogenic emissions. But the problem is not only that. We need to address a much deeper problem, taking into account that these emissions can trigger in the future tipping points in which non-linear effects of climate change can be unleashed, and the situation might become much worse. We can have 2 possible situations if we take into account what can happen after the end of the century, in the last 2 or 3 centuries. If we follow a kind of linear situation, as carbon dioxide emissions will increase, the effect on the Earth can be more or less constant, more or less linear in the evolution. But if, as we saw in the former presentation, we have tipping points, we have non-linear effects, we can have a situation in which after a threshold or a tipping point is reached, the effects of climate change might suddenly go up in a non-reversible way. That's essentially the risk of tipping points. Which tipping points are we talking about? Here we have selected, based on Maslin's book, another reference, the four of the most important and more dangerous ones. Probably the most difficult one is the liberation of methane from clathrates of methane hydrides. Methane hydrides are structures in which a molecule of methane is trapped in a cage of ice, which has a crystal structure, so that the methane cannot be liberated. But usually this situation happen in ice close to the poles, or deep in the ocean, also in high latitudes. But if the Earth is warming, the ice might disappear, and then methane can be liberated. The problem is that in the hyperthermal events that we were talking about in the last presentations, mostly the one that took place 55 million years ago, methane hydrides were liberated, resulting in an addition 5 centigrade degrees expansion of temperature. And the sea level went up by more than 60 meters, creating a situation that lasted for several millennia. That is the high risk, taking into account the liberation of methane. The second tipping point is linked with the dry back of the Amazon rainforest. As the Amazon rainforest is suffering both effects of deforestation, forest degradation, and climate change at the same time, after a given tipping point, which might be very close, according with recent scientific research, rainforests can disappear and be replaced by a savanna or a grassland. As a result, millions of tons of carbon might be liberated into the atmosphere, creating again a huge expansion of carbon dioxide concentrations. There is a third problem linked with the elimination of ice mostly in Greenland and in the Antarctic. If this ice is going to be melted as a result of climate change, the albedo effect, that means the capacity of the Earth to absorb the heat coming from the sun, is going up very dramatically, because the ice and the snow reflect, as they are white, they reflect light from the sun. But if ice is melt, this heat is received and concentrated in the planet. So this massive melting of ice might result in a huge expansion of sea level. And finally, there are other effects linked with sea currents, mostly the Gulf currents in the North Atlantic, that might stop creating even a higher heating in the tropics. To conclude, first, some effects of climate change might be unavoidable as a result of historical emissions, but there is still a very well-defined possibility of limiting them, avoiding the most difficult, most negative, catastrophic effects of climate change. To do that, to reach a warming of only 1.5 centigrade degrees, which is the limit, the goal of Paris Agreement, it is necessary a drastic reduction in fossil fuel consumption and the elimination of deforestation, which are goals to be reached mostly before 2050. Current mitigation policies definitely are not in track with the Paris Agreement goal. So there is a need, an urgent and dramatic need to change global climate policy and to reduce emissions and reduce other factors leading to global environmental problems. If the Paris goals are not met, the risk of a runaway climate change in the following centuries, leading to a hothouse air scenario remains very high. Thank you very much.